Early access newcomer Palworld is the first surprise hit of 2024, eclipsing the concurrent player counts of some of the biggest paid Steam releases of all time and selling over 8 million copies in its first week, and that's without taking Game Pass into account. Why is that? As a fan of Game Freak's Pokémon series since childhood, I embarked on a personal quest to find another game that could satisfy my craving for monster collecting after the neighboring releases of From Software's crowning open-world achievement, Elden Ring, and Game Freak's first major attempt at breathing some new life into their classic formula with Pokémon Legends Arceus. I was lucky enough to have skipped Pokémon Sword and Shield, so the contrast in quality between these two landmark releases woke me up to just how half-hearted the Pokémon games had become. On one side, there was one of the most visually compelling and richly detailed fantasy worlds that I've ever seen in a game, with a wide variety of striking vistas, strong character designs, compelling rewards, and some of the tightest combat to appear in any action RPG of its scope. This is a game so good that it set a new gold standard for open world games going forward. On the other side, we had a limp, empty series of sandbox levels masquerading as an open world game that lacked definition, distinct landmarks, and content. The muddy texture work and subpar geometry complemented the lackluster story and the hollow structure of the whole affair. At least the animations were alright this time. It's crazy to think that this released on the same system as Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which looks remarkable. Don't take this as an unfair comparison. Pokémon is the largest media franchise in the world. If they wanted to produce high-quality titles packed with quality content, as they have in the past, they no doubt have the resources to do so. It was clear to me that something had gone wrong at Game Freak. The studio that once released some of the most compelling and nostalgic adventures of my childhood are now churning out half-baked cash grabs on one of the tightest release schedules of any modern studio. This marginal step forward was hailed as a true innovation that would finally correct the faltering trajectory of the series. Someday. Unfortunately, the promise of better things to come is not nearly as impressive as a bold leap into the future would have been. To compound my disappointment, Scarlet and Violet somehow released the same year with worse visuals and an unprecedented lack of polish, even compared to the infamously buggy Generation 1 titles. Calling them rushed would be an understatement. I've long considered Pokémon director Satoshi Tajiri's winning gameplay formula to be one of the most broadly appealing and universally engaging premises for a game series, about as close to perfection as you'll find, so the franchise is easily able to coast on that foundation even as the quality of the games built atop it have dramatically declined. At this point, the mainline titles that once propelled the series into its position as the biggest media franchise ever are playing second fiddle to the merchandise, the spin-offs, the movies, and everything else, but they sell and review well anyways. That is to say, the financial success of a game in the monster collector genre doesn't shock me, nor do the genre's low standards for success. What baffles me is that Palworld of all things was the competitor to blow up when we've had competition vying for Pokemon's throne for years, with notable examples like the excellent Koromon and last year's Cassette Beasts failing to attain much notoriety despite their extremely high quality. While the shock value of Pokémon with guns obviously played a role, as every article and YouTube thumbnail featuring the game will confirm, I think the answer lies in the synergy between all of Palworld's individual gameplay mechanics and gameplay loops. Since I know a lot of people hate it when video essayists use industry lingo in their videos, I want to define what I mean before we move on. A gameplay loop is a game design term that describes the repeating cycle of actions that a player will perform within a game as dictated by its core mechanics. Let's take a simple two-step example from the greatest board game ever, chess. Both players in this game are at opposite ends of the core gameplay loop at any given moment. One player will evaluate the state of the game by looking over the placement of each piece on the board and the threat they pose before moving one of their own pieces accordingly. Once they complete their turn, their opponent will do the same, and our hypothetical player will need to reassess the board and decide how they want to respond to the changes in the game state. The most important aspect of this arrangement is the immediate feedback that each player receives from the other. This keeps both players engaged in a conversational back and forth until one of them wins or they arrive at a stalemate. Video games operate on the same principle, although their gameplay loops typically surpass chess in complexity and contain some element of long-term progression. Each input feeds a result back to the player, and that result should ideally inform their next input. Every in-state or break in the gameplay, like a save point, loading screen, or cutscene, is a point where the player can walk away from the game. If game designers want to keep their player engaged, they need to fill in as many gaps as possible and keep the cycle moving uninterrupted. This is why developers have long strived to eliminate loading screens and save points in favor of seamless worlds and reliable autosave features. Long cutscenes will ideally share this fate, although we aren't quite there yet. An equal amount of consideration should go into deliberately placing stopping points for the player so they can feel comfortable ending their play session. Souls-likes and Metroidvanias have loads of these, with each rest area acting as a convenient opportunity for the player to exit the game. While these feedback loops are typically rendered as a single circle, I think it's easier to describe some games with a cluster of overlapping circles instead, especially in cases where some individual steps in the loop contain enough complexity that you'll lose something by abstracting them. Knowing all that, what can we say about the gameplay loops of Palworld? Well, I'd argue that there are 4 of them, and that they weave in and out of each other, and that each one gives you plentiful incentives and opportunities to pivot to one of the other ones as you play. Catching pals requires players to scour the world and engage in combat with the local wildlife to soften it up and make it easier to catch. Exploration leads players to unlocking fast travel points, discovering new biomes, creatures, and structures around the world. Combat is debatably a secondary gameplay loop, or perhaps just an individual step in the others, but I want to highlight it here because there are boss arenas denoted by large towers that dot the landscape, and instanced, combat-focused mini-dungeons that break up the areas between them. Finally, we have base building, which is vaguely reminiscent of a colony management simulator. Players must put the pals they've captured to work to automate the harvesting and crafting processes for their equipment. As you progress, you'll unlock new technologies that require increasingly complex recipes and workflows to create, and the demands placed upon you by the other systems will push you into continuously expanding and improving your production capabilities. There's an RPG progression system that ties everything together by rewarding both the player and their pals with experience points for doing basically anything. This is a way to increase your stats, of course, but it's also your main method of unlocking new tools, weapons, and base structures. I'm sure that you can see some of the connections between these different aspects of the game starting to crystallize through my simplistic summary alone, and that's the reason it's so hard to put down. Let's zoom in on the monster catching part of this monster collector first, since that aspect of Palworld has the most in common with Pokémon. Pokémon Red and Blue arguably put the biggest emphasis on catching new creatures until the release of Pokémon Legends Arceus. In those games, Professor Oak's lab assistant would occasionally give you items in exchange for filling out the Pokédex. The most notable of these is the hidden machine for the move Flash, an item that lets you teach that move to a Pokémon of your choosing. This was a field move that helped you light up dark caves, and while it wasn't required for progression, I imagine that most players probably went out of their way to acquire it since navigating dungeons blind is kind of hard.
This isn't your average everyday darkness. This is advanced darkness.
The process of catching Pokémon is simple. While you're in combat with a wild Pokémon, throw a ball at it to roll the dice for a chance at capturing it. Players can improve their odds by inflicting the wild monster with status effects like paralysis or sleep, or by bringing their health down. This is perfectly serviceable gameplay, and future titles would expand on it by implementing wild legendary Pokémon that roam around the world and try to escape from you whenever they're encountered. While Professor Oak giving you a Pokédex and asking for your help to complete his research is the inciting incident of your journey, you don't really have to help him if you don't feel like it, and many players don't. I'd argue that Generation 1 had 4 subplots that unfold as the player progresses. Your rivalry with Professor Oak's son, who eventually becomes the final boss of the game, the Gym Challenge, which sees you roaming around the region and taking on its strongest trainers for gym badges, fighting Team Rocket, a criminal organization that regularly blocks your progress and harasses you, and the Pokémon research that you're doing for Professor Oak. The goal of catching them all kind of fell into the background as the series progressed, with the franchise dropping the famous tagline during the launch of Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire because you couldn't actually catch them all in that game on release. Even if we ignore that, the other plot threads of the Pokémon games came to take precedence over the monster collecting itself. We wouldn't see the series recenter its focus on catching its titular creatures until the release of Pokémon Legends Arceus, where helping a feudal village's professor takes the spotlight for most of the runtime. For this game, the focus is moved away from raising a team to save the world and defeat its strongest trainers, to catching and observing as many pocket monsters as you can. As a result, the game mechanics that players interact with to catch Pokémon have been radically altered. While the combat is still turn-based, you don't need to get into fights with creatures to catch them. You can still rely on the tried and true tradition of softening up your prey in a fight and applying status effects to them if you prefer, but you can also sneak up on Pokemon and throw a ball to catch them unawares, or distract them with food like berries. By allowing players to catch Pokemon outside of battle, Game Freak also made it possible to catch multiple Pokemon at once. There's an almost primal thrill to sneaking up on a group of clueless beasts in the grass and then surprising them by throwing out 3 balls in rapid succession, catching them all within a few seconds. It's so satisfying, and the great sound effects and visual feedback associated with throwing Pokeballs clearly got a lot of attention. Just look at those cute little fireworks. If you mess up and get spotted, the Pokemon will attack your player character directly. You can evade their attacks with your dodge roll or send out one of your buddies as a form of self-defense, but I couldn't help but feel like there was untapped potential in this idea. As soon as you send your own Pokemon out, the wild one will turn its attention away from you immediately, and that sorta took me out of the experience. I wanted to fight alongside my buddies. The game has some solid boss fights where you do just that, but it's more of a tag team arrangement where you and your Pokemon take turns fighting a large enemy. Your research will involve catching the same Pokemon upwards of a dozen times, among other tasks, and the problems start to rear their heads once the obvious repetition of this gameplay sets in. You caught 15 EVs, but what are you supposed to do with them? Each creature you catch is sent to a storage system if your party's full, just like in the mainline titles. However, there isn't any incentive for a casual player to catch a dozen of the same Pokemon until Legends Arceus. Savvy trainers who enjoy competitive battling online might roll the dice a few times to find something with good stats, a beneficial nature, or a specific ability, but most casual players will just catch what they like without thinking too hard about it. Conversely, Pokemon Legends Arceus demands that every player catch each species an absurd number of times to fill out its checklists, but it does not give you anything to do with them once you've done so. They're ultimately disposable, but not in a way that says something about the world the game takes place in. The inevitable counter-argument to this is that having a bunch of Pokemon at your disposal encourages players to experiment with a wider pool of monsters and team compositions than they would otherwise. I generally agree with that position, and the shared experience points that get spread around your party reinforce that idea. Unfortunately, it's not nearly as compelling as it could have been because the battle system in Legends Arceus has been simplified in such a way that all the depth that makes team building worthwhile in the main series has been sanded off. Pokemon don't have passive abilities here, a feature introduced in Generation 3 that's defined the battle system ever since, and their absence really brings the game down. Some Pokemon relied on their ability to establish a mechanical identity, and losing that neuters them. The battles boil down to type matchups, just like the simplistic combat of Red and Blue, which is a slightly more complex version of rock, paper, scissors. This is a basic test of your pattern recognition skills that isn't terribly interesting on its own, and the most notable games in the Pokemon IP build on it as a result. This is the reason that abilities and double battles were introduced in the first place. The only new ideas that Legends Arceus brings to the combat arena are battle styles, 2 modifiers that alter how your Pokemon behaves in the turn order of a fight. You can use Agile style to unleash multiple small attacks in a row, especially useful if you're trying to inflict a status effect with a move they can easily miss, or Strong style for a more powerful attack that delays your next strike, making it most useful when you think the empowered move will KO your opponent. I don't think that these add the depth that the combat really needed to stand out. Since you aren't forced to commit to them, there's nothing stopping you from ignoring them until you find yourself in one of these specific scenarios where they're useful. I don't say this to dunk on Legends Arceus, but to illustrate how little substance the game has beyond its enjoyable catching mechanics. Those don't save the game, unfortunately, and this is where Pocket Pair swoops in to save the day. Palworld replicates the system from Legends Arceus almost verbatim, but with a couple of key changes that make it even more enjoyable. The most obvious change is the addition of an overlay that telegraphs the chance of a successful catch to the player. This can help you decide which kind of Pal Sphere to use, keeps you from wasting them on creatures that are too strong to be caught with what you have, or help you time your throw. I can't understate how useful this is and how much I missed it when I went back to Legends Arceus to record footage for this video. Palworld also introduces weapons for the player to use, ranging from wooden clubs and savage spears to comedic assault rifles and rocket launchers that allow you to engage in combat with pals directly. Now, when a monster attacks you, you're given more agency to deal with the situation. You could fight the pal yourself or send one of your own out to fight alongside them as a proper duo. There's also a handful of pals that can be upgraded to stay outside of their spheres at all times, which means that you can roll with a whole squad if you prefer. This whole experience is quite engaging, and players are incentivized to catch tons of pals by the game's progression system. The research from Legends Arceus sort of returns here, but in a much simpler form. You're rewarded with a huge bundle of experience points for catching a new species for the first time, and for catching the same species 10 times, and you'll constantly be reminded of the progress you've made towards this goal with each new catch. This is probably the most effective way to level up, and it has a few other benefits as well. On the outskirts of the map, beyond the edges of the coastline, you can see man-made wildlife reserves that are home to rare pals that you might not be able to find otherwise. Poaching from these sanctuaries is illegal, as is assaulting the officers who try to stop you from doing so. These are something of a stealth challenge unless you're okay with your face being plastered around the world on a wanted poster. No, just kidding, it isn't that serious, although law enforcement will pursue you until they just forget about it, I suppose. You'll also acquire a bounty for hunting the most dangerous game, but there isn't much of an incentive to do so since humans aren't nearly as cool as eccentric ice weasels or as useful as firefoxes anyways. Unlike Pokemon Legends Arceus, there's a ton of stuff to do with the industrial quantity of monsters that you'll catch on your quest. You can harvest the life force of pals with this horrifying essence converter machine and use it to embolden the flesh of another member of the same species, granting it power beyond human imagination. If that's too dramatic for you, there's also an option to sell them to dubious merchants in exchange for cold hard cash. These merchants also sell pals, often rare ones, and act as another method of acquiring them. Most importantly, you can use pals to automate the production processes at one of your bases. This is where the creature catching mechanics intersect with the survival and crafting systems of the game. Palworld starts the player off with literally nothing except for a device that keeps track of the pals you've caught, basically a Pokédex. You'll have to scrounge everything else up from scratch using sticks and stones scattered around the world. If you'd prefer to punch trees down Minecraft style, you can do that too, but it won't take long to create a stone spear, stone axe, and a stone pick that you can use to collect veins of resources scattered around the world and create some crafting stations. From here, you'll create a pal box, which acts as the centerpiece of all of your operations going forward and your storage system. You can deploy pals to work in your base using this piece of unexplained technology. At first, you're limited to a few helpers at a time, but eventually you'll be able to gainfully employ 15 pals per base camp. Each species has a set of stats that dictate which kind of tasks they can perform and how well they can do them. Some pals are specialists who can only do one or two things, while others can fill quite a few different roles. The most important tasks are probably logging, mining, and smelting, which are required to collect materials from the various renewable sources of basic ingredients. You'll also need to generate food to keep your workforce operating at peak efficiency, which requires pals that are capable of watering, planting, harvesting, and of course transporting the fruits of their labor to a storage box. Each pal has a sanity meter that slowly ticks down as they work, reducing their efficiency or causing them to slack off as it falls. Once you build a command station for your base, you can demand that pals work in increasingly unfair working conditions at the cost of their sanity. They're not unionized, so if one of them happens to get some kind of mental affliction like an eating disorder or depression from this treatment, you can sell them off or butcher them and find a suitable replacement. If you'd prefer to give them the big tech treatment instead, you can construct amenities like a spa and luxurious beds for them to sleep in to help keep them sane. Maybe they'll add a ping pong table and pizza parties in a future update. You'll need to collect a wide variety of species to get everything running smoothly and perform all the tasks that a fully featured base demands. Almost every pal you catch has the potential to come with some randomly generated personality traits that apply a passive modifier to its stats or the stats of others. These can be positive or negative and are sorted into different tiers that adjust the stat modifiers to be more or less pronounced. Many pals will have a mix of good and bad traits that naturally pushes them towards a specific occupation. Some pals are leaders, some are workaholics, some love to fight, and others aren't good for much of anything. Every time you catch a new pal trying to level up your character, you're rolling the dice for a chance to catch something with excellent stats that can improve the efficiency of your production lines or help you deal with combat scenarios. This consistently rewards the player for catching basically everything they see, and therefore incentivizes continuously interacting with the game's catching mechanics. One curious change from the Monster Collector formula that's been widely accepted is Palworld's total lack of the once controversial evolutionary lines that define Pokemon's own progression system. Each pal will always look exactly how it does when you catch it, and while I thought this was strange at first, I think it ended up being a good decision. There's just over 100 creatures in the game's early access launch version, and while this is small compared to the original 151 monsters of Pokemon Red and Blue, it ends up being more than enough to populate Palworld's fairly large open world, since each of those pals is a self-contained species that only takes up one dex slot. In the original Pokemon games, there were only about 6 different species if you compress each evolutionary line into one number, give or take a few, since I'm not sure if it makes sense to call the Nidoking and Nidoqueen lines a different species or not, and the fact that Mew is unattainable through conventional methods. While the world of Pokemon Legends Arceus was segregated into a handful of closed-off zones, Palworld is completely open world, and you won't find any loading screens unless you die, use the fast travel system, or enter a dungeon. The world itself is pre-made, which is good since these survival crafting games usually feature boring, procedurally generated sprawls that lack the deliberate design decisions and intrigue that a more handcrafted environment can offer. Palworld isn't afraid of proudly waving its scope around either. The very first thing you'll see upon taking control of your character for the first time is a sweeping vista that flaunts every major landmark the game has to offer, with some of the details obscured behind mountains or in the render distance fog to hide some surprises for later. The implementation of the fog is quite good. While it's obviously there to save on computing resources, the peaks of mountains, spires, and other structures are visible at all times while you're exploring, making it easy to keep track of where you're at even without looking at the map. All the greatest open world games utilize landmarks in a similar way, with notable examples like Fallout New Vegas, Breath of the Wild, and Elden Ring designed to offer painterly, picturesque views of the massive structures that define the skylines of their worlds. This is a shockingly beautiful game, although I have a suspicion that the Unreal Engine is doing most of the heavy lifting here. There's a decent amount of visual variety found throughout each of the game's stereotypical biomes, and while none of these locales are comparable to the ridiculously creative environments of some of its competitors, they are on par with many other open-world titles. There's a volcano, which is home to rugged fire pals and some kind of flamethrower-wielding cult, different flavors of forests and plains, deserts and badlands with impressive mesas, and a snowy mountain in the north covered with giant fossils. Rivers cut through the islands of the archipelago, acting as natural borders between all of these biomes and as highways for aquatic mounts. The ruins of some ancient civilization are spread around the world, gesturing vaguely towards the game's lore and giving the developers a way to make the landscape a bit more interesting. Things look impressive from a distance, and there's always some reward for getting up close to the most impressive parts of the skyline, be it a boss fight, a dungeon, a treasure chest, or the chance to catch some new monsters. Players are given quite a few options for traversing this landscape, and most of them involve riding pals. Each of them has some kind of special ability for the player to use. Some of them are passive and some of them are active. Many of these are gated behind crafting recipes, but they're pretty much always worth the trouble. The most notable of these are saddles unique to the rideable pals that let you use them as mounts. There's grounded mounts that run at high speeds, and some slower flying mounts that allow you to circumvent geographical obstacles and ascend to the top of mountains easily while ignoring fall damage. Players can also use certain aquatic creatures to jet around the rivers and oceans of the map. Unlike the mounts from the recent Pokemon games, you get to take your pick from a big list of pals. Some of these mounts are better at some tasks than others, so it makes sense to keep multiple mounts at your disposal and switch between them on the fly. While switching between mounts isn't quite as seamless as it is in Legends Arceus, I'd argue that giving players the freedom to choose their favorite pals to navigate the world with is better than forcing them to use the box legendary or some preset designs. It makes their connection to the monsters that they chose feel more significant and personal. This entire system synergizes well with the open world, since there's no invisible walls to prevent you from going anywhere you want until you fly out into the ocean at the edge of the map, which you have no incentive to do anyways. Pals share their stamina meter with the player when they're mounted, meaning that investing in your own stamina stat will make all of your travel options more efficient. In addition to the monster-based transit options, Palworld has its own versions of the most notable movement mechanics from Breath of the Wild. You can climb literally everything in the environment at the cost of stamina, and craft a glider that makes it possible to soar through the air or negate fall damage. There's also a few grappling hooks that the player can use to navigate the world as well, and while there is a fair amount of jank that comes with each of these movement options, exploration feels fluid. It's really fun to climb up cliff sides and fly above the treetops hunting for loot and creatures to catch. Plus, there are tons of useful items to look for while you're perched atop a vantage point. The most important of these are the fast travel statues that have been peppered around the map. You have to activate these before you can use them, and you're rewarded with technology points for doing so. These points are one of the most valuable rewards that the game has to offer, so tying them to both leveling up and exploration was an excellent decision. The rules of the fast travel system itself also act as an incentive to unlock as many of these as you can, because you need to be at a fast travel checkpoint or one of your bases to warp around. If you overextend into hostile territory that's beyond your level, you can't just leave by opening your map and teleporting away. Believe it or not, this actually addresses one of my biggest complaints with Elden Ring's fast travel system. That game lets you fast travel from pretty much anywhere as long as you aren't in combat, deflating all the tension that might come with walking into a part of the world that you aren't strong enough or skilled enough to tackle yet. Palworld's enemy levels are tied to the region of the map they spawned in instead of scaling alongside the player. This, combined with the general aggression and lethality of the wildlife, gives the world a sense of danger and texture that we rarely see in big-budget open-world games. The consequences for death are pretty severe. You'll drop the pals you were carrying and all the items you had on you as well, so it can be genuinely nerve-wracking to see a new, scary-looking creature in the distance. Fast travel points are carefully spaced out across the world. Every big boss arena will have a checkpoint right next to it, but some of the most dangerous parts of the map don't have any convenient warp statues to ensure that they have a proper sense of desolation about them, to make it feel like you're deep in the wilderness and have no easy way to return to civilization. I think it's safe to say that Palworld delivered on the fantasy that Legends Arceus promised with its first trailer, where it was revealed that Pokémon would attack the player directly. It's kind of shocking how they managed to strike such a perfect balance between tension and convenience with this fast travel system, and I hope that more games adopt a similar style in the future. The smaller rewards for exploration are all useful too. Life Monk effigies are green statues that you can find scattered in the nooks and crannies of the world that can be used to increase the effective catch rate of all of your pal spheres permanently, saving you a ton of time and resources. There's also boxes of loot containing currency, pal spheres, miscellaneous items, or one of 3 tiers of pal souls, which can be used to permanently increase the attack, defense, health, or work speed of one pal of your choosing. You might also happen across literal skill trees, nice one, with glowing, blue bark that bear fruits capable of teaching your pals new attacks. These seem to grow in high places and are always a treat to discover. I already praised how the render distance fog allows the top of structures to stay visible, but all of these collectibles have equally well thought out visual indicators to help players spot them from afar. The Life Monk effigies and fast travel points have distinct glows that you can spot from miles away, making it easy to scout for them no matter what time of day it is. It also keeps the smaller rewards off of the game's user interface, which makes them feel more like diegetic elements of the game world. That's always something I appreciate. While exploring, you'll find those boss arenas and mini-dungeons that I mentioned earlier. These reward the player with ancient technology and ancient technology points, which can be used to craft some of the most valuable tools in the game, like the grappling hook and the essence converter that I mentioned earlier. These dungeons are probably the weakest link in the game for the same reasons that these sorts of recyclable mini-dungeons always are. There's only a handful of pre-baked room layouts that get repeated often, and they lack the handcrafted feeling of the rest of the game as a result. There isn't much variation between dungeons either, and you'll be seeing many of the same rooms across the entire map, regardless of what biome you found the entrance in. If there's anything that needs to be improved later in development, it's these. Fortunately, the combat is simple and brisk enough that you never feel like you're getting bogged down by protracted fights or sluggish dungeon crawls. As you can see, there's quite a few progression mechanics tied directly to exploring the environment, and each of them feeds back into the other gameplay loops of catching, battling, or base building. The only one of these that we've not yet discussed in any depth yet is the combat, which is a lot different from the turn-based gameplay that Game Freak's become known for. Palworld's fights take place in real time, and your pals are not under your direct control unless you're using them as a mount. You're free to roam around and attack enemies with melee weapons or a gun while your pals cycle through their own elemental attacks at the same time. Curiously, they can only have 3 attacks equipped at a time. That's lower than average for a game like this, but you can edit their loadout whenever you want through the party management screen. Pals remember every attack they learn forever, so you're not forced to stick to the same 2 or 3 attacks for every encounter. Some pals have quirky, combat-focused active abilities that players can use to command them directly on a cooldown, and others can be used as weapons. Perhaps the most humorous skill among these is unlocked when you craft a harness for Foxbarks. By grabbing a hold of the harness, you're able to pick up your Mozilla Firefox and use them as a flamethrower. Stuff like this is charming, and it gives Palworld a lot of character, while also giving you unique ways to interact with your buddies. While this isn't the most unique or challenging combat system I've seen in an action RPG, it's interesting to me for 2 reasons. The first is that it encourages players to put themselves into the fray and create battle strategies around the pals in their party. You can become a frontliner who stays close to enemies while dodging or tanking damage with armor and a shield, which functions kind of like the energy shielding from the Halo series by blocking burst damage, or lay down covering fire while one of your tanky pals absorbs damage for you. The energy shield also acts as a form of one-shot protection for those cases where you're in way over your head. you're free to withdraw your pals from combat at any time, even if they're about to get smacked in the face by a massive, super effective blow that would put their lights out. A tactic you'll probably need to get familiar with if you want to keep your favorite pals kicking. The potential for team building is even more pronounced in multiplayer servers, where players can mix and match different pals to maximize their type coverage in combat. The type chart here is quite a bit different from the one in Pokémon, but the idea is the same. Each type has a few strengths and weaknesses that form a rock, paper, scissors style metagame. Some of these relationships are intuitive or were taken directly from Game Freak's own type chart, but the overall structure of Palworld's system is a little coked out. The biggest issue to my eye is that fire is the only type effective against more than one element, which sort of makes it the best? The balance is a little off, but at least it's easy to memorize the chart and keep it in your head. I found it pretty easy to ignore typing for most of the game, but your mileage may vary there since my ace was a Crimis, whose normal type attacks make it equally effective against basically everything. The developers really need to add more interactions between types in the future, especially if they want to introduce PvP to the game, because I don't think it's adding enough strategy to the combat in its current iteration. The other thing that I like about the combat is that your lack of control over your pals makes them feel more like autonomous beings that you're cooperating with instead of commanding, which I've never felt in Pokémon. I know that's a weird thing to say about a game where you can set these creatures to work on a soul-crushing production line, but I did start to feel kind of attached to the pals I carried around with me. Every time a pal in your party gets seriously injured, they can't be used again until they've had 10 minutes to recover and awaken from their coma by sitting in your storage system. I'm not sure if there's a way to make them heal faster, but this was a great idea either way. The absence of my aces was sorely felt every time I slipped up and allowed them to take lethal damage, helping me appreciate their contributions to my team more than I would have otherwise. You don't know what you have until it's gone. This timer also encourages you to keep more than 5 combat-focused pals on rotation, giving you room to experiment with new types and party compositions after a tough encounter wipes your crew. When I reflect on my experiences with Palworld, I get those same sentimental feelings that I always have when I look back at the monsters I used for an entire playthrough of Pokémon Crystal or Emerald. We experienced crushing defeats, escaped dangerous situations by the skin of our teeth, and climbed our way to the top of the world's most imposing mountains together. I know that this comfy vibe came from the game mechanics and the option to nickname my pals, because I'm not a huge fan of most of the actual creature designs in this game. They're serviceable, but they lack the elegance and charming design sensibilities that you can see in the most popular Pokémon, outside of a few notable examples like Chillet and Daisy. I think the obviously amateur aesthetics of Palworld and its odd-looking monster designs are the main culprit in its heated reception online. The game does look quite good, especially for something made by around 10 people, but unlike Coromon or Cassette Beasts, which have a clear artistic vision driving their sound and music, Palworld looks more like a knockoff than a serious attempt to compete with other monster collectors, although I'd argue that looks are misleading here. The music in Palworld doesn't quite compete with longtime Pokémon composer, programmer, and director Junichi Masuda's best work, but it's hard to find soundtracks that do. The iconic music of the Pokémon series has always been one of its biggest and most consistent strengths. Although Palworld's cinematic soundtrack is serviceable, none of the songs are long enough or interesting enough to avoid falling into the background of your adventure. I doubt the game had the budget to hire a real orchestra for these pieces, but that's the vibe it's going for. Uncommon and odd time signatures are used to keep the combat and boss themes feeling tense and unpredictable, with some memorable melodies occasionally managing to creep up to the top of the mix. It all feels suitably grandiose considering the sheer scope of the world, and the game dynamically shifts between tracks as you weave in and out of combat or cross the borders between different zones of the map. Despite its lacking art direction, it feels like a novel combination of ideas. It's a freakish patchwork of concepts and mechanics lifted from other successful games, but being derivative is not an inherently bad thing. Each mechanic has been carefully chosen and implemented with a keen awareness of how it all fits together. That sort of thing doesn't happen by accident. There was a clear vision behind this project. The developers at Pocket Pair have given us some insight into how the game was made. They were learning how to make models and rig them up as they went, and didn't understand how to use version control, one of the most basic skills expected of software developers. It's obvious that they're leaning on the refined toolkit of Epic's Unreal Engine to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them. You can tell that the game is held together by duct tape and ambition just by looking at it, and playing it probably won't change your mind about that. It is rough around the edges, with plenty of janky mechanics and bugs to go around, but its deeper flaws only start to rear their heads in the late game, where the pacing slows down on account of expensive crafting recipes that chew through rare resources like refined ingots. There's also no real ending yet, no climax, no overarching goal that everything's building up to, and I suspect that's going to be really disappointing for a lot of folks. Maybe that'll come in a later update, maybe not, but I think that the gameplay that's here right now is worth the money if you can tolerate survival crafting games and enjoy a day out on safari. There's an acceptable amount of densely packed content on display here, even compared to some full-priced releases, and I never found a part of the map that felt blatantly unfinished. If anything, this is a notch on the belt of the gameplay is king crowd, and yet another example of an indie developer who has no idea how to code a game making something successful anyways. I'll be the first person to hop on the video games or art train if that much isn't obvious, and I'll always be there to play an innovative or unique experience when it comes out, but I'm not quite pretentious enough to think that everything should strive to be seen as a cohesive piece of fine art, especially when the appeal of video games comes from playing with systems and mastering game mechanics. This kind of artistic expression is exclusive to this medium, and tearing something down just because it doesn't look like art by the standards of other mediums poisons the discourse. If Palworld is a cynical, trend-writing cash grab that's trying to be a greatest hits collection of fun mechanics from all the most successful titles of the last decade or so, then Pokémon itself is something far worse, because it isn't even trying to keep up with the rest of the industry at this point. We've been stuck with the same combat system for 10 years, and the best Game Freak can do when they aren't outright removing things is staple some temporary gimmick onto the formula that they'll inevitably drop in the next game, like Z-moves or Gigantamaxing. They've completely failed to build anything on the mechanics that they spent so much time polishing in generations 1 through 6. The stagnation has made it really hard to play these games, let alone enjoy them. The artistic flair and themes that characterize Game Freak's early work have been absent for years. While the games are still kind of giving urban kids a way to go bug hunting in our increasingly urbanized world, they've stopped trying to comment on real-world political issues like land reclamation or the value of preserving tradition. Their old Ghibli-esque approach to whimsical environmentalism has been abandoned in favor of churning out as many shoddy products as possible just to keep the wheels turning. Maybe I just grew out of Pokémon, but I can't help but feel that the older games did have more passion and effort put into realizing their potential, or at least into making them feel like they were worth the money. Sacrificing quality to drop 2 obviously unfinished games in a single year, and then asking you to buy 2 DLCs in the place of post-game content is about as cynical as it gets, and the only way things are going to change is if other developers can step up and beat Game Freak at their own creature-catching contest. Palworld probably won't be that game. Hell, maybe the devs will just take the money and run like so many other early access studios have, but at least it shows us that it's possible. Personally, I see Palworld as a love letter to all the games that it's taking inspiration from. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, after all. The crew at Pocket Pair clearly like Pokémon, they like Breath of the Wild, they like survival crafting games, and they probably liked Elden Ring too if the giant world tree is anything to go by. They have an intimate understanding of why people enjoyed these games, and you can't fake that kind of thing. Larger studios have tried. I enjoy most of those things too, so the experience resonated with me in the same way that indie bands that rip off The Smiths and New Order do. The passion for the material on display here is obvious, and I share that passion, and it's something that a lot of other people seem to have connected with too. That is the artistic value of the work, and I haven't felt that way about Pokémon in a tragically long time. This might be yet another addition to a long line of Flavor of the Month early access survival games. Of course it is, but I know that I won't be forgetting the time I spent with it anytime soon, no matter how the rest of its development pans out.